Toma, right here. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the lab of Dr. Ralph Greenspan at the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego, California. And his presentation is entitled Biology and Biologists, the Remote Roots of the Moral Crisis. Dr. Toma. There'll be a little technological pause here for 1 moment.
Don't you turn it on then?
Well, you could be the judge after the comments of Dr. Griffiths here on whether my argument is going to work or not. So I might be a case in point of what his last comment about culture here is, whether I'm just throwing out an argument or not. So. We scientists are toys. So I'd like to begin by contrasting two types of etiologies. First off, I shouldn't call it an etiology, that of John Paul II in Fetus et Ratio, where he says, the God of creation is also the God of salvation history. It is the one and the same God who establishes and guarantees the intelligibility and reasonableness and natural order of things upon which scientists commonly depend, and reveals himself as the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So what the Pope is saying is, as many of us know, is that between the natural order, in other words, the material universe, and the supernatural order, that revealed truth, there's a certain complementarity and mutual interaction. This is based on the truth the Church teaches that God created both of these orders in the divine image, and so the laws that pertain to both the natural order have analogous ones at the supernatural level because they're both rooted in the divine nature. And the Pope sort of sums this up by saying the two modes of knowledge, revelation, and philosophy lead to truth in all its fullness. So we can know truth in both orders. Contrast this with Stephen Jay Gould in The Rocks of Ages. He's a major evolutionary thinker and scientific writer, who says, I do not see how science and religion could be unified or even synthesized in any common scheme of explanation or analysis. Instead, he posits what are called noma, or non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, there's two approaches to reality: science for facts or nature, and religion for morality. And the two have nothing in common. The two shall never overlap or meet in any way. And he concludes by saying, I am not a believer. I am agnostic in the wide sense of T.H. Huxley, who coined the word and identifying such open-minded skepticism as the only rational position, because truly one cannot know. So ultimately he says that being able to know truth is impossible. And the Pope sort of acquiesces that this skepticism has become the dominant opinion, where he says about the common mind and the fact that this has worked its way in philosophical research, and particularly metaphysics. And he sums this up by saying, in brief, there are signs of widespread distrust of universal and absolute statements. Which brings me to the point of my talk. Are these two different opinions, are they based simply on religion, or is there something else beyond that? Or below that, I should say. And the point that I want to make is I think, yes, there is something else below that. These two different approaches to reality are based on, ultimately, two different approaches to nature, two radically different approaches to nature. And specifically, I think there's a problem in the ultimate approach that science takes toward nature. And not in the, I want to make this very clear, not in the methodological approach and the data it collects. I think that's sound. But the ultimate means it takes toward nature and uses to interpret its data. And I don't think this is contained in science either, but has spread to many other intellectual endeavors in the modern world. And this includes morality. And I think it's also this very thing, we don't, and morality is ultimately based on one's nature. We don't expect a dog to behave like a human because it's a dog. And so, I guess another thing I'm trying to say is, I've worked with scientists for about 10 years now, and I've had many arguments about morality and things like this. And so what is and no matter how much we discuss these things, there seems to be this unbridgeable gap between the two. What is the actual flip switch that the scientists can't seem to get around, that the Pope seems to understand? In other words, why can't they conclude to these same things that the Pope has? And I think there is a basis for this in the approach to nature, and this is what I want to try to communicate. And I think Aquinas holds a disposition as well. He says the consideration of creatures is also necessary to set aside errors. For errors about creatures lead men away from the truth of faith by being opposed to the true knowledge of God. When man does not know the nature of creatures, he does not know his place in the universe and will sometimes subject himself to creatures. And those things we've been talking about this morning. As to those who thought things were ruled by the stars, nowadays who people think they're ruled by their DNA, my genes made me do it, instead of subjecting himself to God. It is therefore false to say that we think about creatures is unimportant so long as we think correctly about God. For an error concerning creatures leads to false opinions about God. At the same time, it directs the minds of men away from God by subjecting them to other beings. So if we err in nature, according to Aquinas, we err in our understanding of our place in the universe and in our relationship with God. And I think one of the reasons for this, why nature is so important that we as Catholics don't consider so much, is the faith ultimately does not teach us how to think. The faith does not replace nature. It heals it, it perfects it, and ultimately transforms it, but it does not replace our nature. And we're created as intellectual creatures of flesh, and therefore the way we approach reality is through material being. We must obey the laws of the physical universe and how we come to know truth. And so the first question, I think, in approaching nature, what is the correct approach to nature? The first question for any question that we ask is not so much what is truth or what is false, but what can we know? We can't say something is true until we know something. So what are the most noble things that we have? And to this, I think I'll appeal to who I consider the ultimate master of nature and his texts that discuss how this occurs, Aristotle. And I just want to quote 2 paragraphs of the first part of this physics and just very briefly go over them to make a couple points. He says, when the objects of any inquiry in any department have principles, causes, or elements, it is through acquaintance with these that knowledge and understanding is attained. For we do not think we know a thing until we are acquainted with its primary causes or first principles, and have carried our analysis as far as its elements. Plainly, therefore, in the science of nature, too, our first task will be to determine what relates to its principles. The natural way of doing this, and I think this is the key statement, the natural way of doing this is to start from those things which are more noble and clear to us, and proceed toward those which are clear and more noble by nature. But the same things are not noble relatively to us and noble without qualification. So we must follow this method in advancing what is more obscure by nature but clear to us toward what is more clear and more noble by nature. Now it's a bit of a mouthful, but basically he's saying something that every man, woman, and child agrees to, at least implicitly, and doesn't practice every day. Because every time you learn something, this is exactly the way we proceed. So focusing on this first sentence, just a few statements about it. Simplistic example, a little bit more complex example. A simplistic example from California here. So, if you have a piece of kiwi fruit and your neighbor comes up to you and say, what does it taste like? And you say, well, it tastes like a cross between a peach and a strawberry. In other words, what you're doing is you're explaining to him the unknown, the kiwi fruit, on the basis of things that are known. And we do this in many instances. The electricity flows through the wires. Nobody's ever seen electricity flow. This is something we take from our common experience of water moving. And so we relate the unknown on things that we know better. So, a more complex example, let's take that of aeronautical engineering. Among several principles an aeronautical engineer presupposes in his discipline are Bernoulli's principle and the laws of gravity. Now, everybody knows what the law of gravity is. So, Bernoulli's principle talks about how the shape of the wing causes a differential pressure zone, a low pressure zone on the top of the wing relative to the bottom. And this literally draws or vacuums the plane up into the atmosphere. And so the aeronautical engineer does not prove this in aeronautical engineering. He knows them to be true from something else, in other words, physics. But by these two principles, by these two premises, he designs this airplane. In other words, the wings and the fuselage and the tail section are all known as means of maximizing Bernoulli's principle and minimizing gravity. And so it can, in effect, be said that the plane is known on the basis of Bernoulli's principle and the laws of gravity. So let's back up one step. I said both of these were known from physics. Let's just focus on gravity. So when Newton set out to prove the laws of gravity, or to at least describe them mathematically, what was most known at the beginning of his discipline was the simple observation that things fall, the simple observation of gravity, the apple falling and hitting him on the head, according to the story, and he himself or any other object falling. And so by this principle, he described the mathematical equations for gravity, because if he would have described a mathematical equation that said things were going upward, he would have looked at reality and saw that was wrong and corrected it. Now, with both these disciplines, also the conclusions there's something we got to point out about the conclusions. With the aeronautical engineer, no matter how well he designed his aircraft or how poorly he designed his aircraft, they had no effects on Bernoulli's law or the law of gravity. In other words, if you were designing a plane that couldn't get off the ground, he would not say, well, gravity's all of a sudden increased. Everybody said a ridiculous argument. And the same thing with Newton. If he couldn't have described gravity, he wouldn't have in turn claimed that there's no such thing as gravity, the simple observation of gravity. And so this brings us to our first point. In any given process or body of knowledge, what is most known are the initial premises. And upon these, the conclusions are found. And the conclusions in no way affect the knowability of the premises. Now, if we just back this up one more step to Aristotle's, this particular sentence over here, for we do not think we know a thing until we are acquainted with its primary causes or first principles. So what does he mean by that? So if you keep moving this process backward from Bernoulli's law to the laws of gravity, so forth in physics, ultimately you come to a set of principles that human beings simply know. They don't prove. And Aristotle called these things first principles. We can call them self-evident principles. Now, my apology to the philosophers here. I want to keep this on a very basic level, which reasons that would become very evident. So the best way I think to understand a self-evident principle is, let's say you have a person that totally denies external reality. So he's walking along, you pick up a rock and throw it at him. And just before it hits him, he catches it out of the corner of his eye. And he ducks, as any of us would. And so whether or not he in theory agrees to anything external to him, in practice, his senses force him, and his bodily reflexes force him to acknowledge it. And he has to eat and take in oxygen in order to survive, and get money and things like that in order to live. And so there's many ways the external world, at least on a practical level, impinges itself upon him, whether or not he agrees to its existence or not. We can think of self-evident principles the same way. They're not known, they're not proved. They are known. They're not proven, they're not demonstrated, we're not born with them, and they're not innate, but they are simply known. And upon these, all our judgments about reality are based. And they're also distinguished from what we call common opinion or common experience, a common opinion from the fact that they're known across all cultures and all times. So we'll just give one quick example of one of them, the principle of non-contradiction, that people may have heard of. The same thing, in many ways of stating, the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time in circumstance. So, in other words, it's saying what is true, something can't be true and false at the same time. Now, so the very act of denying the principle of non-contradiction, by saying the principle of non-contradiction is not true, you in effect affirm its existence. And if you look at the different writings and philosophical and scientific writings and commercial writings and the economic writings of different societies and different ages past, they all use the word not in their sentence. In other words, they're affirming this principle. And so I want to sum up what I've just said by saying in other self-evident principles are the same way. And so I want to sum up this quote with Aristotle. He says, in every question there must be something known and something sought which we do not know. In other words, you have premises and you have conclusions. No question is asked concerning immediately evident matters, in other words, self-evident principles, which, though true, involve no immediate knowledge. In other words, they're simply known. Truths of this kind, since they are evident, do not submit to questioning. In the same way, the principle of non-contradiction doesn't submit to questioning. By the very act of questioning it, whether or not it exists, you affirm it, because you use the word not in the act of questioning. So, let's go over a few examples from one artificial example and two from science to sort of nail this down. The Pieta versus the Moses. So at the beginning of the art of sculpting these, the thing that was most known, according to Michelangelo, was what he wanted to make, i.e. the Pieta or the Moses. So this idea guided, in the same way that Bernoulli's principle guided the airplane, this idea guided his art and his craft. In other words, he wanted to marry the sorrowing mother with a certain amount of love in her face, so he carved her face a certain way. Moses, the transcendent lawgiver, who sort of sees beyond the physical. And so by the idea, these things were completed. And no amount of conclusions, in other words, there are several ways of making this. He could have made it bigger, smaller, or he could have done cut slightly different angles. And so, no matter what the conclusions are, because he would have said, in other words, if he wouldn't have made this exactly the way he wanted it, he would not have said, well, I didn't want to make a pieta. Of course, that's what he wanted to make. It's obvious from what the conclusions are. So the conclusions, again, in no way affect the premises. They don't affect what was initially known. And there's one other thing I want to point out about the conclusions of his craft. In other words, like I said, he could have made both differently. We don't exactly know if this is the way he wanted to make it. No one can say for certain that this is precisely the way Michelangelo wanted to make this. In other words, was this coat cut exactly at the right angle that he wanted? Was her hand held exactly the right way? He could have even covered up Christ's hand by pulling this part of the cloak over that. So there's certain relativity in all conclusions. The conclusions, while they're much more precise, are very precise in detail, we do not know exactly if they could be in several different ways. The same thing with the Moses. But we do know what he wanted to make. It's obvious from just looking at this. So the premises are more known, but they're less detailed. There are several ways of making it. But the conclusion, while more detailed, is less known. In other words, we're not certain exactly the way we could be in many different ways. Now let's take a look at the Human Genome Project. What is most known at the beginning of the Human Genome Project is what you started with. You started with a human being, you started with a fruit fly, my coworker over here, I work on fruit flies. And so, again, the human being was the thing that was most known, that guided your process of discovery. You don't call this the genome human, you call it the human genome. You call what is less known on the basis of what is more known. You don't say DNA human, you say human DNA. And you don't run off to a bear to get something for a human. You don't run off and get bear DNA to research into a human being. And so the DNA is known upon the basis of what it was taken from. And likewise, no amount of sequencing of the DNA, no amount of the conclusions, will ever convince anybody here in this crowd, or myself, despite all the biology books on in the shelves around the world, that we're going to know what a human being is. I already know that I'm a human being. I already know that I have a certain amount of dignity. And the conclusions are never going to affect that. And the conclusions specifically in the Human Genome Project, there's 32,000 genes so far. The Fly Genome Project, you heard, was 14,000. There's some odd billion of these little nucleotides over here. These are little building blocks of DNA. But again, these are relative. It may never be known that if you follow scientific literature, there's been several reports on estimations among the genes. With the nucleotides, it may never be known. I've used these sequencing machines, or they have just an inbred or built-in error rate. They're tiny little things, and they make mistakes sometimes. So again, the conclusions are very much more relative than what the premises are that you start with. We can make one more example with red light. What is known at the beginning, when the scientists tried to figure out what the nature of attributes of red light are, that it was 650 to 700 nanometers. What was most known was the fact that he had red. He simply looked at the red light to see as the basis for his experiment, to see if that's what he was going to research. He didn't take blue light. And so, as he found out it had 650 to 700 nanometers, this in no way impinged on the initial premise. In other words, you're not going to run outside today afterwards and all of a sudden realize that you can recognize red better than you did before or after I told you it was 650 or 700 nanometers. And likewise, these conclusions are very uncertain. It's always possible to calibrate your scientific instruments better. And sometime in the future, you may get 699.9992765 as opposed to 700. And so again, there's a certain relativity in the conclusions. And that brings me to my next point, that knowability and precision are inversely related. The thing that is most known is the thing most evident to our senses. The thing that is least known, and while much more precise in detail, like Michelangelo's finished sculptures, have an inherent relativity in them. And so how does this relate to science and morality and things we've been talking about? Well, let me appeal to no less authority than Niels Bohr, who was the founder of quantum mechanics. When he said that, just one quick example from him, he said, all science is based on cause and effect, another self-evident principle. In other words, you start off with certain types of causes. In other words, you set up your experiment a certain way, you have certain controls, and you end up with an effect. There's your results. So no amount of scientific research, no matter how advanced it gets, could ever contradict this, because in effect what you're saying, if you did say that a science could prove that cause and effect does not operate in the universe, what you would be saying is that the very structure upon which this experiment is based and the very thing that conveyed you your knowledge is in effect invalid, which is an inherent contradiction. And so we've also seen that science proceeds in the same way with the Human Genome Project, aeronautical engineering, researching on light. And so, as I said, in terms of the methodological approach of science, it is forced to proceed this way because this is what Aristotle was saying here. I do not think is an opinion, but it is the way human beings learn. And you, just like the rock, you're forced to accede to external reality. So you're forced to learn according to the mode that you're given by nature. However, at a theoretical level, science does just the opposite. And so so this is Aristotle's statement again. We go from what is known to what is less known. This is an introductory textbook at a Big Ten university. I won't name which one. It may not be the same edition used now. But so you start off with molecules, the cells, and you have 2 chapters: Mr. Darwin, the meaning of life, evolution, reduction of life. Small molecules, electrons, atoms, so forth. Molecules, elements. Genetics and gene regulation, evolution, then plants and animals and their behavior. These are the least things known to human experience. Nobody's had experience of molecules, and you had to show these existed by science. They're conclusions of science. What is most known to your senses when you go to approach biology, biology is the science of living things. The distinction between animals and non-living things are what are most known to your senses. And so what this in effect is doing is taking the conclusions, which are the least known things, and then positing them as the premises of which all nature should be understood. And we end up with a conclusion like this. Oops, let's just skip over. Well, somewhere it managed to disappear. Well, I'll just paraphrase it then. A biochemistry textbook, graduate level, which states basically in the very first chapter that we do not need anything other than chemistry and atomic interactions in molecules to explain life. That in the author is very perplexed as to why people insist on having something to, like an essence, to have to understand that life exists. That all we need is such things as atoms and their interactions. And so you're left with a conclusion like that, again, because the whole order of this book is trying to build upon the notion that you can explain, it goes from the least known thing to the more known thing, which it should be inverted the other direction. This is an example of Catholic homeschooling book. Again, collections arguably should be up where they're at. You're comparing different types of animals, but immediately breaks down the previous structure that we saw. Again, this is something we saw at the beginning of the talk. So you have, and I think this is, I taught Catholic high school for a few years in science. And in many of the high school departments, what you do is they clean up their theology, those who are trying to reform, or their religion departments, and then they take more noxious things out of the curriculum, like the soul of all, and they leave it that way. But, so what are they doing is the doctrine of religion, which is not self-evident, you have to teach it. And then these conclusions of science, which are not self-evident, you have to teach them. So you end up with a Noma like Stephen, and you end up with a Stephen J. Gould that you're educated in. Evolution is another good example. People who beat this into the ground, but I'll just say this again. This is a conclusion of science that you have a certain mechanistic causality operating in nature, and it's posited as a premise of which all of nature should be understood, to the exclusion of all other types of causality. And such things as teleology or final causality, which is taboo in science. Although all of us had experience of that as intellectual agents we operate for an end, yet we work through mechanisms to achieve our goals. And so why evolution can overturn this is again the notion that they base this as a premise, as a given on which all reality should be understood. I think another good example, before I get to this one real quickly, and I'll credit all I'm going to say about, is psychology at a very practical level for human moral life. I'll credit all I'm going to say about that to a very close friend of mine, Dr. Richard Cross, who's written quite a bit about this problem in psychology. And basically, again, what he says is that you take the conclusions of a large body of scientific research into the certain psychoses and neuroses and posit those as the premises upon which all psychoanalysis should be understood. A study starting out with a given, which all human beings have the experience of, you, me, and everybody else, that we're intelligent agents that operate for an end. We go out and we get milk at a store, we know the end of our actions. We therefore know things as good intrinsically good since we know the ends and we're moral agents. Instead, psychology supposes when it starts out that we are not moral agents, and all these things can be explained on the basis of our basic animal instincts or animal interactions. Again, this is a very close related to this is human intelligence and consciousness. I deal with this directly. The place I work at, its whole purpose is to explain human consciousness and how the brain works. And so just a couple of points. I think this is one of the biggest assaults on something very important to Catholicism that science is using right now. Neuroscience is a huge field. And so just a few quotes from Aquinas. He says, "It's impossible to attain knowledge of the divine and highest causes except that we can acquire by actualizing our intellectual power. And if we knew nothing about the nature of this power, we should know nothing about the nature of immaterial substances." And he says, "We cannot master the science of morals unless we know the power of the soul. And understanding is an act proper to the soul alone, meaning the body only provides its object." How does science go about this? Well, you take a whole series of data, again, on animal research, that animals have the same type of physiology, that they can build structures very complex. Their societies are very complex. Ants and bees have societies that are incredibly complex and intricate, just like human beings. They can learn. Many animals can learn better than humans. They can memorize. Animals are excellent, have excellent memory. They can communicate very well. So you take all these things and you say, well, just give us a little bit more time and see we're chipping away at this. And intelligence and consciousness, again, will fall into this fold, that everything is reducible down to the notion of animal interactions. Again, but it is evident to every human being, the premise upon which all this, why would you be talking about human intelligence and consciousness to begin with? The premise of this is our own personal experience that we're intelligent, rational agents working toward an end. And Aquinas points this out as one of the things that distinguishes humans, is that as a result of being able to understand cause and effect, we're generalists. In other words, a polar bear, for instance, is a beautiful example of applied structural engineering. And so I have one of the harshest environments on Earth. You put him on the moon or in the tropics and he immediately dies because he doesn't have the ability, he doesn't know the nature, the very intrinsic causes of structure and insulation, and therefore can't adapt. So being generalists, no other animal is a generalist, and Aquinas points this out as one of the things that distinguish humans from all other animals. So I mentioned real briefly, for those of you who aren't scientists, that I think this also has one quick example, and I'll conclude, that it has implications in things other than science. And one of the things I think I have noticed is in the historical critical method of analyzing Scripture. Now, this is not my area of expertise, and I'm not trying to criticize it as a method. Whatever its merits or demerits, I would propose, however, this is not the way you educate people about it. So, in other words, it's very much like a Catholic homeschooling text. You start out with maybe a few proper things, saying that Scripture is divinely revealed, that it's infallible, but the whole thing is immediately broken down in this literary analysis of the Old Testament. And this is from an introductory textbook to a major Eastern seminary. I don't know if it's used anymore, but I have it on good authority of other ones similar to this that are being used. And so, what is most known at the beginning of with the faith, while they're not self-evident, what is most known as the written tradition of the church, in other words, Scripture and its oral interpretations through the popes, the councils, and the fathers, and the doctors of the church. And so what it should start out with is an extensive analysis of the oral tradition, oral understanding of Scripture, and then maybe in another course talk about what literary analysis can contribute to this. And so I want to conclude by basically saying that I think what is wrong in what the big break between scientists and people and Catholics talking about this is there's a certain cleavage in their understanding of and presuppositions about nature. Basically, science takes the conclusions of this work, which are the most unknown things, as we've seen, the most unknown things, and posits them as the premises upon which all nature should be understood. And of course you're going to have skepticism as a result. It's a proverbial house built upon sand. You start out with the most relative and the unknowable thing to human beings, and you posit them as the means of which we understand all reality. And so, and as we've seen with examples from human intelligence and consciousness and evolution, when you invert this order, and then the practical application through psychology, there's a slow chipping away at any distinction of kind of human beings from animals. And so naturally you're going to have abortion, contraception, euthanasia, in vitro fertilization. Why not? We're just the same as animals. And then also the breakdown of the living to the non-living even exacerbates that more. And I think also referred to earlier today, again, this goes on beyond science, even in philosophy. The great metaphysical proofs for the existence of God are all premised upon these philosophy of nature proof and classical philosophy. So these types of proofs of immaterial being are going to be totally vacuous to modern man because the premises are not understood as being absolutely necessary. And the Pope, I think, alludes to this as well with theology, where he talks about the great Trinitarian, Christological, and the sacramental doctrines in Fides et Ratio as being premised upon classical philosophy as well. And so, in conclusion, I'll just make one quote from Aquinas, where he says, "From this we evidently gather the following conclusion. Whatever arguments are brought forward against the doctrines of the faith are conclusions indirectly derived from the first and self-evident principles embedded in nature. Such conclusions do not have the force of demonstrations. They are arguments that are either probable or sophistical, which all scientific arguments are. They're just based on probability. And so there exists the possibility to answer them." Thank you.
We have time for some questions, so would you like to field those? Look.
Congratulations on the stress you placed on Neurosciences Thomism. I do think that one of the problems we have by teaching reproduction is that some of our biggest institutions have abandoned Aristotelian Thomism. And I question further as they made a philosophy and theology of science. I don't know. Is there any other philosophy that you could
They got
recommend
in their bags.
replace you?
Okay, also they're very
Keep wondering about that.
Okay, so the question was, I couldn't hear you quite, but let me try to rephrase your question. So you were asking whether because of a lack of stress in the Aristotelian mystic tradition that has problems on what we've been talking about today, and is there any other philosophy that can replace that?
The problem I think is that science is becoming almost, as good as science is, becoming almost like a philosophy of science, philosophy of theology.
Right. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, let me back that up with a bit of a broader question. And actually, I'll try to shoot myself in the foot first, because I think it's a good way of answering it. The Pope specifically says in Fides et Ratio that the Church does not choose any particular type of philosophy. And I think it's a good way of actually approaching the question. I will answer that directly, what you asked. But I think we have to look at the reason why the Church says that, and then we can, I think, get a better understanding of what Father over here asked. So we have to ask the question as to who the Pope is, and so we can phrase it one way as he's the guardian of ultimate, the primary guardian, or the guardian of ultimate truth. And what is the truth the Church teaches? That there is an infinite, uncreated being that has revealed himself to us. And I think the two operative terms in this are infinite and uncreated, because basically it's totally removed from any experience of ours, and so we use the terms analogously describe them, with analogy being in the strict sense of the terms simple but simply different. And so and everything else besides God is finite and limited in some way. So no matter how powerful a given philosophical tradition is, and no matter how profound it may be, when compared to what it's aimed to try to maybe in theology to describe a real doctrine, it is simply nothing. And so I think that's the reason the Pope has to say this is the Church has to be open to every single type of philosophy. It would be wrong for a theologian to concentrate on one particular type of philosophical inquiry to describe the faith, simply because none of them, no matter how powerful they are, can ultimately even come close to describing who God is. Having said that, however, from the human perspective, and to answer your question directly, I do think there are, in everything in human experience, we have people that are stronger, we have people that are faster, we have people that are weaker, we have people that are smarter, we have people that have more stronger will. We have mathematical systems that are better than others. We have a literary system, people that would be considered great poets or lesser poets. Everything in human experience in the material world is great in terms of hierarchies, and I don't think philosophy is any exception. And I would say, therefore, that, yeah, I do think to answer your question directly, I do think it has been a bit of a breakdown at the natural level in these questions of Catholic morality because of the neglect of the Aristotelian